I came to the Pentagon about 3.5 years ago. I came into an office called Future Concepts and Transformation, and our job there is to kind of cast the net way out into the future. Typically we start 18 years in advance and try to look out as far as we can. And that kind of centers around 30 years. And one of the things that we do is we sort of build scenarios for the Air Force to wargame in. And as I was looking out at the trends that were of concern that might cause conflict, clearly there were some that were preeminent and that you heard a lot from the community. And there were concerns such as, what are the possible impacts of climate change? What about this notion of peak oil and peaking of cheap fossil fuels? And a collaboration began between our office and Air University Center for Strategy and Technology. And I began talking with a very bright, now Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel at the time, Mike Karnacek, who wrote a very influential paper, War Without Oil. And we started thinking about what at the time was not really on anyone's radar screen, which was really the overall national security implications of the fossil fuel cheap energy that we had becoming less available, and whether or not that might cause all sorts of different things, such as competition among great powers that might lead to conflict, and then less capable nations being priced out of the energy market, and the potential for failed states and that sort of thing. So it started a significant search on our part to see, well, are there game-changing technologies and ideas out there that might offer us a way out? And I was fortunate to host a number of featured speakers from the DOE, from industry, from other places looking at different ideas, and as well as a number of the different people who were looking at studies of once oil peaks, how far out, what kind of wedges would it require to come up to speed. And the deficit, the scale of the problem was just so incredible that the few of us that were looking at it really became concerned of what the security consequences would be. And so we began looking for a number of different concepts. And one of the things that I was fortunate to come across was space solar power. And at the time it was a tremendous long shot, and at the time very few people, comparatively to now, were concerned about oil prices or concerned about oil peaking. And this was really an unknown idea that had just fallen off the radar once again. NASA had just canceled their program almost right after I heard. And so we became worried that, hey, this idea has no advocacy, no community to speak for it, and we really thought that it required some additional due diligence to look at. And we were thinking about it primarily within the context of national security. And at that time, I was also talking about very long-term space concepts with Colonel Coyote Smith. And we were talking about how revolutionary this idea would be and how good for our tech base and things. And eventually we got together and we started making a briefing, and it got around. And we decided that we needed to do some additional due diligence on the part of the people looking at the problem in OSD and within the Air Force logistics community. And then at some point, after we'd had several audiences with some very interesting and high-level folks, Coyote got us an audience with one of our heroes over there, General Armour. And General Armour had the foresight to actually give us an official blessing to go forth and do a study. General Armour allowed, and Coyote took the personal risk of doing an open internet study, which no one had ever done. And so to actually have a completely open concept in DoD looking at war prevention, international in scope, was just a fabulous thing that had never been done before. And as we looked through it, you know, the concerns about global energy, you know, global climate, our own national tech base, our own ability to compete, continued to move forward, and we were able to kind of come to a consensus that, yeah, this idea, we don't yet know whether or not it will close. There's plenty more due diligence to do on it. But my gosh, wouldn't everything change if it could? And doesn't it deserve at least a little bit of due diligence to find out for sure if this really could help prevent what we see as the potential for real destabilization in the future. And then, so the report happened, and unfortunately for us, Coyote had to leave, but the report was finished, and we were able to deliver it to Mr. Joe Rouge, who was gracious and courageous enough to release it to an audience that in some ways was probably not as receptive as we would have hoped to have. Now, I will say also that we have internal needs. The Air Force is, you may know, is the largest green customer of energy. And you know, we want to continue to be that. We would like to be a customer of green energy, and we would certainly like to grow our space and industrial sector upon which we depend. But as Coyote has said, you know, we don't want to be the ones who build commercial systems. So, you know, we have carried the torch up till now, hoping that it will ignite a policy debate and put the idea on the table, because up until now, this has not been part of the national conversation on energy options. Even climate aside, you know, people debate about which direction and exactly where the hump falls. But the basic problem is that all of our easy-to-access fossil fuels will peak and then decline. They don't go away for quite some time, but the demand curve keeps going. And if you look at what look at how much of this is fossil fuels. I mean, how much of our demand? And this tiny little yellow sliver is the carbon-free options, right? The solar and what people are expecting to fill. It's going to have to plug this gap, assuming that the population follows that, you know, pretty conservative model. That is an unbelievable, you know, guess to hope that it's going to go from here to there. And that's without any of the things that these guys are talking about the need to reduce that down to make up for these, here's nuclear, but these non-fossil fuel things. One of the reasons why space solar is attractive, because graphically, 1/60th the carbon output of a coal that's not putting it in. But now I want to show just a couple of Matt's charts that I think are really interesting. So he wanted to go into the actual, you know, how are actual wells doing in terms of their production. And he just goes through a bunch of them, showing that they come up and then they peak. They plateau and then they peak. You know, some of them they get bigger and then they all go down. You know, Mexico, you know, if the radio was to be believed, just the day before yesterday was saying that like 40% of their revenue is oil-based. And they are in serious decline now in terms of their production and what they're going through. And this is Cantarell, their largest one, which incidentally is tied to other things. Cantarell has a relationship to an asteroid crater, and that's how they actually found and discovered it. But you take a look at how these are actually declining in their curves. Prudhoe Bay. You know, even Sarah, who he says debunked it, you know, they still show it, you know, within the time frame that we ought to be thinking about. But when you actually start looking at the data, you know, of what's out there and how quickly it goes away, it's at least something that requires a significantly greater look. You know, whether or not the production actually is sustainable at a higher level than it is now is something that deserves to be looked at with much greater scrutiny than it is now. And certainly those of us that are concerned about the growing demand and hoping for a bright future where we're not just writing off a significant part of our population. And take a look at, you know, this, you know, what we're seeing in China. And the other problem is many of the nations that are currently exporting are growing their own internal economy. And as they grow their own internal economy, that's less of their exporting oil that they can sell out. And even as we try to do demand, you know, destruction on our side and try to reduce the amount that we're using, we have to consider that as oil goes up, that favors certainly the Middle East developing economies, and that gets offset. So there's significant projected oil demand out to 2030, and right now, you know, it's very iffy as to whether or not it's going to be able to keep up with the demand even in the short term. So
what about undiscovered fields? You know, some people think that there's...
I've got a great chart on that. I don't have it at my fingertips.
Okay.
But basically, undiscovered fields happen, but if you actually look at what's discovered over time compared to the... it's very bleak compared to the major finds were in the past.
Can I make one comment about this? There are some people who think that there are a lot more, I'm almost done, that there are a lot more resources of oil, but actually follow the money. Oil companies are valued on Wall Street by the magnitude of their you know, quote, oil reserves.
Right.
And for example, Shell was fined recently a significant sum of money for overestimating how many reserves they had, not underestimating.